There are people who move through adulthood as if carrying a quiet season inside them, one shaped years ago, before they had the words to name it. Their lives look ordinary from the outside, yet something in them still listens for footsteps from the past. A tone of voice, a sudden silence, a door closing a little too hard. Childhood does not end when the years pass. It lingers in the body, in the breath, in the way a person learns to expect the world. What happened early becomes a shadow, sometimes soft, sometimes heavy, following them into every room, long after they've grown taller than the memories that made them. There comes a moment in adulthood when a person realizes that not every reaction belongs to the present. Something small happens, a conversation shifts, a message is delayed, someone's expression changes, and the body responds with a tension that feels older than the room they're standing in. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It's a quiet tightening inside the chest, a familiar drop in the stomach, a wave of vigilance or withdrawal. These are the echoes people carry, often without knowing why. Recognition arrives slowly, sometimes in the way they apologize too quickly, sometimes in how they silence themselves even when no one is asking them to, sometimes in the patterns they repeat in relationships, overgiving, over-explaining, or walking away the moment something feels uncertain. It's a strange sensation, as if their life is being lived in two timelines at once. The adult they have become and the child who still fears the world the way they once learned to. For many, the shadow first appears not as memory but as instinct. A person may struggle with trust even when they desperately want connection. They may crave reassurance yet feel uneasy when someone gives it. They may remain hyper-aware of tone, posture, small shifts in mood, skills learned in childhood when unpredictability was common, when survival depended on reading a room faster than anyone else. These traits follow them into adulthood, not because they are flawed, but because the mind protects what it once loved or feared. There are those who flinch at kindness, doubting it will last. Others harden themselves, believing softness is dangerous. Some grow quiet in conflict, not because they lack thoughts, but because raising their voice once had consequences. And there are people who, despite their intelligence and strength, continue to feel inadequate, as if some unseen judge from the past still calls their name. Living in the shadow of childhood often means carrying emotions that do not match the present moment. A simple mistake may bring overwhelming guilt. A minor disagreement can feel like abandonment. Praise feels unreal. Criticism cuts too deeply. The adult tries to reason with these reactions, but the child within still remembers the rules of a world they no longer inhabit. Psychology calls these imprints emotional conditioning. The body recalls what the mind forgets. Neural pathways built during early years become default responses later in life. The shadow becomes less about what happened and more about how it shaped the person's expectations of safety, love, and belonging. Yet even in this quiet struggle, there's a certain tenderness. These echoes reveal how deeply a person once needed comfort, how strongly they tried to adapt, how fiercely they learned to protect themselves. Their sensitivity is not weakness, it is the story of someone who survived their own beginning. And before the roots are explored or the science is explained, there's this first truth. They are not broken for feeling this way. They are simply hearing the distant footsteps of a past that taught them to listen too closely. To understand the shadow a person carries, the story must return to the beginning. When the world was small, voices were large, and every experience felt bigger than their body could hold. Childhood is not remembered in sequence, it is remembered in sensations, in the rhythms of a home, in the expressions adults made when they were tired, stressed, or disappointed, in the way love was offered or withheld. The roots of the shadow often grow in places a child cannot interpret but can deeply feel. Some grew up in homes where emotions moved like weather, warm one day, storming the next. Others lived under constant expectation, learning early that mistakes were not allowed. Some had caretakers who were present in body but distant in spirit, and there were those who lived with more than silence, criticism, chaos, pressure, fear. They adapted because children always do, but the adaptation came with a cost. In those early years, the brain was forming at a pace it would never match again. Every glance, every tone, every reaction carved patterns into the developing nervous system. The child learned what love required, what safety demanded, what triggered anger, what brought praise, what caused withdrawal. These teachings were not spoken aloud, they were absorbed like breath. Psychology explains this through attachment, the invisible blueprint a child forms about relationships in the world. Secure attachment grows when caregivers are consistent, emotionally available, and predictable. But when the environment is unpredictable, distant, or overwhelming, the blueprint changes. The child may become anxious, always scanning for signs of rejection, or avoidant, learning to rely only on themselves, or disorganized, torn between wanting closeness and fearing it. These are not choices, they are adaptations, each one shaped by the need to survive emotionally. A child in an unstable environment becomes hypervigilant, watching every shift in mood to prepare for what may come. A child in a cold or dismissive home learns to bury their needs so they won't be disappointed. A child who grows up around criticism becomes self-critical before anyone else has the chance to be. But the shadow is not created only by what happened. Often it is created by what didn't. The comfort never given. The soothing words never spoken. The emotional safety never felt. Children don't understand absence. They internalize it. They come to believe that emptiness is their fault. Years later, the adult may say, "Nothing terrible happened to me." And yet the shadow exists because their childhood was filled with quiet injuries that left no visible mark, emotional neglect, unpredictability, lack of safety, or the simple absence of someone who noticed their inner world. Neurology shows that these early experiences shape the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the stress system. The brain learns what feelings are dangerous, what people cannot be trusted, what needs must remain hidden. Even when the environment changes, these pathways remain. And so the shadow follows, not as a punishment but as a reminder of how deeply the past once mattered. The child learned how to survive, and those lessons stayed long after survival was no longer necessary. This moment of their story is not about blame. It is about understanding. Because once the origins are seen clearly, the rest of the story can begin to shift. There comes a time when a person begins to sense the quiet tension between who they once were and who they are now. It happens slowly, a recognition that their reactions do not match their current reality. A shift in awareness when they notice that the world around them is no longer the one they were shaped by. They start to see the distance between the present moment and the echoes they still carry. This is where the inner conflict begins. Not loud, but steady, like two parts of the self standing in opposite corners of the same room. The child within still believes danger is close. The adult around them knows they are safe, yet the nervous system continues to respond as if it must protect something fragile. Psychology calls this emotional incongruence, two timelines coexisting, two truths overlapping, the past that shaped them and the present that tries to reach them. This conflict is not a flaw. It is the natural pull of the brain's memory systems, where trauma or emotional deprivation strengthens pathways of fear, vigilance, or withdrawal. These pathways do not fade simply because a person grows older. They fade when the brain learns, through repeated experiences, that the world has changed. But before that learning can happen, there is resistance. Sometimes the resistance shows up as doubt. The person feels undeserving of peace because it is unfamiliar. Other times, the resistance appears as fear of vulnerability. Opening up feels like stepping into a room where the lights once went out without warning. The mind knows the present is different, but the body remembers being left in the dark. And then, often unexpectedly, comes a turning point. Not a dramatic event, but a subtle shift. It might be the first time they allow themselves to stay in a moment of kindness without pulling away. It might be the realization that someone's disappointment does not signal danger. It might be noticing that a raised voice no longer means they must shrink or disappear. These moments accumulate quietly, building a bridge between past and present. Neuroscience describes this as neuroplasticity, the brain's lifelong ability to rewrite old patterns. Emotional safety, when experienced repeatedly, begins to soften the old defenses. The amygdala fires less intensely. The stress response eases. The prefrontal cortex gains more influence. With time, the body starts to believe what the mind has long understood. The danger is gone. Healing, however, is not about erasing the past. It is about integrating it. People learn that the child they once were did the best they could, that the shadow they carried was not a curse, but a map of how they survived. And slowly they stop blaming themselves for the ways they coped. In this stage, the person begins to reclaim softness. They start trusting themselves enough to rest. They allow imperfection without fear. They learn to speak their needs gently without expecting rejection. What once felt like a wound becomes a story. What once felt like a burden becomes context. They do not forget their childhood, but they no longer live beneath it. And so the shadow that once followed them begins to fall behind. Not because it disappears, but because they finally step into a life illuminated by understanding. In that quiet light, the past becomes just one part of who they are, no longer the shape of their entire being.